I want to probe Mr. Kempton on something you raised about the Prop 1A implications of the revenue guarantee. And on a different set of topics, Mr. Van Ark and I have had a lot of conversation lately about Proposition 1A and what it requires. But we've struggled, Mr. Chairman and members, around this issue of that you referenced in that Prop 1A, as we discussed, I think a year and a quarter ago in your committee, when transportation precludes further public subsidy, but the business plan, as drafted and as far as I know is still in place, requires essentially a guarantee in order to pull private sector investors into the mix, and we end up in this catch-22 of, well, I think you made the statement a little earlier. If you want to attract those private sector investors, you're going to have to, and I think you also referenced the federal funders, you're going to have to make the commitment clear of public funds from California, and yet we've got the language in 1A that seems to preclude that. And we've had some discussion in the past, but I think the issue is largely unresolved, which is, how might such a thing be crafted? Because right now it looks like we've got two mutually exclusive goals on the table.
I believe what we were trying to indicate, perhaps we didn't do it clearly, is that to attract private money into any major, in a public-private partnership arena, and we do a lot of that, to attract it in, there has to be surety on the private side. Obviously, they're putting up equity money. They want a return, they want insurances. They always look to see if the public side has stepped up and is definitely going ahead with it. And I'll be very frank, there have been a number of projects in the U.S. that have created to the detriment of private investment because got halfway down the road, invested money, and the thing was canceled. What we're getting at here is perhaps typically in a lot of federal projects, usually there is authorization legislation. That doesn't say that you've got the money, but it authorizes it. And with that in place, this provides the surety that the federal government is for the project and will back it. Maybe they'll take 20 years to do it, but at least there's that shit on the table. And usually private investors will look for something like that. That's what we're getting at. In other words, is the funding assured? Do you have heads of terms with the local governments, for example, in place to talk, even though you haven't settled any issues on how much contribution there may be? Are you at least going to heads of terms? Are those kinds of documents there? Is there an authorization bill for the project at the federal level? That's all we're saying. So, in other words, to ensure that people are behind it in the public sector.
But I would just like to follow up on Senator Simitian's question. You make the distinction between exactly what we meant by the both the authorizing legislation and by the bond. And you raise the issue, well, if there's the initial infrastructure investment by the public sector, and that is being paid off through either federal grants or the bond or our state bond for the for the construction of the hardware, the actual system itself, that may be paid off by the general fund. Let's assume that will be paid off, although that is still a discussion because that's what you're raising. Mm-hmm. But let's just assume that is to be paid off by the general fund. What we invest in by the bond will be paid off. Then you come to all the maintenance, the upkeep, the operations, the ridership, the actual running of it, which is operating subsidies. That's it. Are you clear? Are you saying there should be that you do not want the legislature to change that there will be operating subsidies? You're just saying you want to clarify the difference between the initial investment and that. But it seems to us, and getting back to what Senator Simitian is saying, it's very unclear what revenue guarantee, how that impacts the operating subsidy. Can you comment on that? Do you think there should be a revenue guarantee to help the private investor operate if it doesn't reach its numbers?
I think from the
And you're asking us to change the legislation to do that.
and I think we're very
doing that?
we're very clear with respect to the message we would deliver to the legislature on this point, Mr. Chairman, and that is that the enabling legislation has talked about no operating subsidy.
Right.
We are not talking about changing that feature.
No revenue guarantee for any operation of the
No operating subsidy as currently exists, and we can point to several examples around the world where that has worked, where systems are able to operate effectively under those kinds of requirements. If that operating subsidy definition is expanded to include part of the capital investment, including bond payments and debt service, that becomes very, very difficult.
Okay, I just wanted to be clear that you're not saying a revenue guarantee for any operations of the project.
And we have not proposed that, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Simonian.
Thank you. But that's a very helpful and I think an important clarification and distinction. But it still leaves on the table the issue of how do we stay Prop 1A compliant with respect to the commitment to avoid further public subsidy while accommodating, if that's the ultimate goal, the desire of the High-Speed Rail Authority to provide a revenue guarantee for operations as envisioned in the business plan.
And I can't speak to that. It's a better question, maybe better directed to Mr. Van Ark, but the business plan is being updated, as you know, and we expect a new version out in October. We're hopeful that it incorporates a number of our recommendations, and we're hopeful that it deals with some of these issues in a realistic and responsive way.
So you would recommend that in the updated business plan it not include what Senator Simonian is
Again,
operating?
our recommendation is very clear.